Imagine a punishment where death was not swift, not even the main objective. Instead, imagine a sentence designed to stretch humiliation into days until the weight of ridicule, exposure, and pain finally broke the body. In medieval towns and ancient cities, women were sometimes condemned not to die by sword or fire, but by shame itself. Picture a woman locked into an iron collar, chained to a post in the marketplace. Each passerby sneers, spits, or mocks, her body left exposed to sun, rain, and hunger. Another is strapped into a cucking stool, dunked again and again into freezing water until lungs give out. Some are bound in wooden pillories, spikes pressing into their skin while rotten food and filth rain down. These devices were not accidents of cruelty, they were engineered spectacles of humiliation. The question is chilling. Why would societies design punishments where the slow erosion of dignity was the true goal and death only the final chapter? What did it reveal about a culture that saw a woman's shame as justice and her suffering as entertainment? Tonight, we uncover the devices that shamed women until death and the dark logic that demanded their existence. The devices that condemned women to die through humiliation were not crude improvisations. They were crafted with deliberate precision, each one designed not only to cause suffering, but to ensure that suffering was seen, mocked, and remembered. Pain was never enough. These punishments demanded shame, and shame was engineered into the iron, wood, and spikes. The iron collar was among the most notorious. A thick metal ring locked around a woman's neck, it often included spikes that dug into skin or chains that tethered her to a post. The victim was forced to stand in marketplaces or crossroads for days. Eating, sleeping, even moving became torment. As the hours stretched into days, infection, dehydration, and exhaustion took hold. But the real cruelty lay in the exposure. Every passerby was invited to witness her disgrace, to jeer, to spit, to throw filth. Death came slowly, sometimes through starvation, sometimes through infection, but always through humiliation. Equally infamous was the cucking stool or ducking chair. Women accused of gossip, witchcraft, or immorality were strapped into a wooden chair mounted on a long beam. The chair was then swung over rivers or ponds, plunging the victim into icy water again and again. The crowd cheered with each dunk, laughter rising as the woman choked and gasped. Some survived the ordeal, but many drowned after repeated submersions. The punishment was public theatre, and drowning became its grim finale. The pillory with spikes combined immobilization with degradation. A woman's head and hands were locked in wooden boards, her body trapped upright in the town square. Some versions included iron spikes that pressed into flesh if she moved. The crowd became executioner in all but name. Rotten vegetables, mud, and stones were hurled at her. Children mocked, men taunted, women turned away in pity or disgust. Days of exposure left victims vulnerable to infection or violent assault. Many died not from the device itself, but from the cruelty it invited. Then there was the drunkard's cloak, also called the shame cloak. Originally used for men accused of drunkenness, in some regions it was forced upon women accused of vanity, gossip, or infidelity. Victims were made to wear heavy barrels or grotesque cloaks painted with mocking images. Some cloaks weighed so much that standing became unbearable. Others were designed to restrict breathing or movement. Women paraded in these cloaks collapsed from exhaustion, suffocating under the weight of ridicule as much as the wood itself. Each of these devices shared a common thread. The punishment did not end with physical pain. It continued through public participation. The iron collar cut into skin, but the jeering of neighbors cut deeper. The ducking chair plunged women into water, but it was the laughter above that drowned them in shame. The pillory trapped the body, but it was the rotten filth hurled by passers-by that destroyed dignity. The cloak weighed down the shoulders, but it was the mocking songs that crushed the spirit. What makes these devices particularly chilling is their longevity. Records show iron collars used in European towns well into the 18th century. Ducking stools were employed in England and colonial America. Pillories, though eventually outlawed, were fixtures of public justice for centuries. These were not fringe punishments, but central tools of social order designed to enforce silence and submission. For women, the consequences were harsher. Men accused of crimes often faced swift execution or imprisonment. Women accused of gossip, witchcraft, or sexual disobedience faced slow humiliation. Death by shame was not only tolerated, it was institutionalized. Communities accepted the sight of women chained, dunked, or paraded as normal, even necessary. The infamous devices revealed the dark genius of control. They turned punishment into performance, pain into entertainment, and women into symbols of disobedience, crushed beneath ridicule. Their iron and wood were not just tools of torture, they were stages on which death by shame played out, over and over again. Punishment in the medieval and early modern world was never meant to be private. To rulers, silence behind dungeon walls was wasted justice. True discipline had to be seen, heard, and remembered. And so punishment became theatre. Public spaces, market squares, bridges, riversides were turned into stages where suffering was displayed, humiliation broadcast, and shame weaponized until it killed. Take the iron collar. A woman chained to a post at the heart of the town did not simply endure the weight of metal, she endured the gaze of hundreds. Market days ensured maximum attendance. The spectacle was not accidental, it was orchestrated. Town criers announced her crime, whether gossip, disobedience, or defiance, and the crowd gathered with the same enthusiasm as for a festival. Children laughed, men sneered, and neighbors whispered. For the condemned, every minute was torture. Her body weakened from exposure, her spirit eroded by ridicule, until life itself seemed impossible. Death did not come with a single blow, but with the slow crush of shame. The cucking stool was staged by water for a reason. Rivers and ponds were natural theatres. Townsfolk crowded the banks as women were strapped into chairs and dunked again and again. The rhythm of the beam became the drumbeat of humiliation up, gasping for air, down, swallowed by icy water. The crowd cheered with each plunge, laughter mingling with screams. When death came by drowning, it was received not with solemn silence, but with applause. A woman's last breaths became part of the performance, her death treated as the final act of a cruel play. The pillory turned every passerby into a participant. Women locked into wooden boards were placed at crossroads or in marketplaces where traffic was busiest. Their immobilized bodies became canvases for public contempt. Rotten food, dung, stones, and insults rained down. Some victims were beaten so severely by crowds that they never left the pillory alive. The authorities did not intervene, they expected the crowd to do their part. The spectacle blurred lines between justice and mob violence, with shame the weapon as much as pain. The shame cloak revealed the same theatrical logic. Imagine a woman stumbling under the weight of a barrel, painted with mocking words or grotesque drawings. She was marched through crowded streets while musicians played, neighbors jeered, and children sang rhymes about her disgrace. The punishment was not about physical harm alone, it was about turning her into a walking carnival attraction. Exhaustion or collapse was inevitable, but what truly killed was the certainty that her dignity would never return. These spectacles were carefully choreographed to maximize humiliation. Punishments often began with processions, victims paraded through town to the jeers of onlookers. Sometimes officials read aloud their supposed crimes at each stop, ensuring no one missed the lesson. At riverbanks, dunkings were repeated until the crowd was satisfied, not until the victim was safe. At marketplaces, women remained in pillories from sunrise to sunset, their suffering woven into the rhythm of daily commerce. Communities were not passive spectators, they were participants. Laughter, mockery, and thrown objects were encouraged. In some towns, it was considered a civic duty to jeer at the punished. To remain silent or sympathetic was to risk suspicion. In this way, the theatre of punishment not only humiliated the victim, but bound the crowd into complicity. Cruelty became culture, shame became entertainment, and death became acceptable when disguised as performance. The theatrical nature of these punishments also explains their endurance. They were not only about correcting individuals, but about disciplining entire societies. A woman punished in public was a warning to every wife, daughter, or neighbor watching. The devices symbolized what awaited those who dared to speak too freely, love too boldly, or disobey too openly. Fear spread faster than law ever could, carried not in written edicts, but in memories of humiliation witnessed firsthand. The logic of spectacle turned shame itself into a sentence. Death was not the explicit goal, at least not officially, yet exposure, exhaustion, drowning or beating often ensured that humiliation ended in death. The authorities could wash their hands, claiming the device was corrective, not fatal. But everyone understood the truth. Shame was as lethal as the sword, only slower and more degrading. At its core, the public spectacle of punishment revealed how deeply humiliation was woven into the fabric of justice. It was not enough to confine women in silence. Their disgrace had to be paraded, mocked, and consumed by the crowd. Death by shame was not an accident, it was the essence of the sentence. To understand why devices of humiliation so often targeted women, we must look beyond the iron and wood to the fears that forged them. Men and women both broke laws, both disrupted communities, both angered authorities. Yet the punishments designed to degrade, to silence, and to parade through streets were overwhelmingly aimed at women. The question is not only what crimes women committed, but why society considered their actions more threatening than theft, violence, or even treason. At the heart of this gendered targeting was fear of women's voices, fear of women's sexuality, and fear of women's independence. These fears were not whispered, they were preached in sermons, written into laws, and passed down in stories. They shaped not only how women lived, but how they were punished when they stepped beyond their prescribed boundaries. Consider speech. In patriarchal societies, the female voice was treated as inherently dangerous. A man could argue in court, shout in taverns, or boast in markets without fear of humiliation. A woman who spoke too much, however, was labeled a scold, her words framed as disruptive poison. The scold's bridle and shame masks were designed specifically to silence women. No man was ever strapped into a bridle for gossip. Only women were considered so threatening in their chatter that iron spikes had to pierce their tongues. This was not justice, it was fear disguised as law. Sexuality was an even deeper source of anxiety. Women's bodies were viewed as both coveted and dangerous, symbols of temptation and ruin. Punishments like iron corsets, ducking stools for immorality, and public pillories for suspected adultery were all rooted in the fear that women's worst desire could destabilize households and dishonor men. A husband's infidelity was often excused as weakness. A wife's infidelity could lead to public drowning. The imbalance reveals a society obsessed with controlling women's bodies while excusing men's. Independence, too, terrified patriarchal order. Women who resisted arranged marriages, challenged husbands, or sought authority outside domestic roles were cast as dangerous rebels. Devices of shame were used to rein them in. Chains symbolized obedience, cloaks mocked ambition. Public humiliation reminded communities that a woman's first duty was submission. By targeting women with humiliating punishments, societies reinforced hierarchy. Men ruled, women obeyed, and any deviation was crushed in spectacle. The legal records reinforce this imbalance. In English parish courts of the 16th and 17th centuries, women made up the majority of those punished for public order offences like gossiping or scolding. Men might be fined for drunkenness, but women were bridled. In Germany, shame masks depicting animals were almost exclusively used for wives accused of jealousy or quarrels. In France, ducking stools were reserved for women suspected of witchcraft or infidelity. The pattern was clear. Where men were disciplined with fines or swift executions, women were paraded and mocked. The cultural narratives of the time fueled these fears. Religious texts emphasized Eve's disobedience, painting women as naturally deceitful and prone to temptation. Folklore warned of gossiping wives whose tongues needed binding. Philosophers and physicians described women as weaker, but also more cunning, justifying both their subjugation and their special punishments. By portraying women as both frail and dangerously powerful, society created the perfect excuse for humiliating devices. This targeting also reassured men. Watching women paraded in shame reinforced male dominance. A bridled wife in the marketplace reminded every husband of his authority at home. A drowned gossip warned daughters not to question fathers. A chained adulteress proved that men's honor could only be defended by women's humiliation. The punishments were as much about protecting male pride as they were about enforcing law. It is important to note what these punishments did not target. Men who killed, stole, or fought were rarely subjected to devices of shame. Their punishments emphasized retribution lashes, imprisonment, execution. Women's crimes were often nonviolent acts of speech, sexuality, or defiance. In other words, men were punished for what they did, women for what they were. This distinction reveals the deep gendered logic. Women themselves, not their actions, were the problem to be controlled. And so, shame became a tool of patriarchy. The humiliation was not incidental, it was central. Societies feared that without such visible control, women's words might spread dissent, women's desires might destabilize families, and women's independence might unravel the hierarchy itself. The devices were weapons, but they were also warnings, crafted to remind every woman watching that silence, chastity, and obedience were matters of life and death. Every punishment carries meaning. A sword stroke says justice is swift. A prison cell says crime brings isolation. But the devices that shamed women until death carried a different message altogether. They were designed not only to punish, but to symbolize, to transform women into living warnings for everyone who watched. These devices were less about individual guilt and more about collective discipline. Their iron and wood spoke a language that entire communities understood. Silence is survival, obedience is law. The iron collar was not simply a restraint. It was a brand. Heavy, spiked, and unrelenting, it turned the woman's body into a public signpost. Chained to a marketplace post, she became an emblem of disorder corrected. The collar's circular shape symbolized endlessness. Her shame had no escape, her suffering no reprieve. To passers-by, she was not only a woman, she was a warning that gossip, disobedience, or independence would choke under iron. The cucking stool used water, the element of life, as a symbol of death and disgrace. Rivers nourished crops and sustained towns, yet here they became tools of ridicule. Each plunge into icy depths inverted water's symbolism, turning renewal into punishment. The crowd saw not just a body drowning, but a message that women, ES voices like the bubbles rising to the surface, would be submerged until silence prevailed. The pillory with spikes created a human stage. Immobilized, the victim's body became a canvas on which society scrawled its judgment. The wooden frame symbolized confinement, but the spikes symbolized more. that even the slightest attempt at resistance would bring pain. To the crowd, she was not a person but a living metaphor of restraint. The community could project its fears, hatreds, and frustrations onto her body, reinforcing unity at her expense. The shame cloak symbolized ridicule itself. Grotesque drawings, exaggerated costumes, and heavy barrels transformed women into caricatures of sin. A woman accused of vanity might be forced to wear a cloak painted with mocking faces. An adulteress might be paraded in a barrel labeled with her crime. The symbolism erased individuality. She was no longer Jane or Anne, she was vanity, gossip, or adultery personified. By reducing her to a living symbol, authorities reminded every onlooker that identities could be erased if behavior strayed beyond acceptable bounds. What united all these devices was their reliance on visibility. The punishments did not work in silence or in shadows, they thrived in light and laughter. Their power lay in being seen. Symbolism without witnesses is meaningless, and so the devices ensured that shame became spectacle and spectacle became memory. Townspeople carried those images home into kitchens and bedrooms, whispering warnings to daughters and wives, "Never invite such disgrace." The symbolism also reinforced patriarchy on multiple levels. On the surface, it warned women of direct consequences, but beneath that it reassured men of their authority. A bridled woman symbolized control restored to husbands. A ducked wife reassured neighbors that disobedience would not spread. A cloaked adulteress allowed communities to laugh at the inversion of female virtue. Symbolism worked in both directions, terrifying women while soothing men. Religious layers deepened the message. Clergy often justified these punishments as moral lessons. The collar symbolized submission to divine order. The dunking stool symbolized purification through water. The pillory symbolized penance, the body offered as sacrifice for sin. These interpretations transformed cruelty into virtue, making spectators believe they were not mocking women, but upholding God's will. In this way, humiliation became holy theatre. Perhaps the most insidious symbolism lay in how these punishments erased the line between justice and entertainment. A woman's suffering became a public story, a cautionary tale acted out before the crowd. Each device turned her into narrative, her pain into parable. The message was clear: women's bodies were not private, but communal property, to be disciplined, mocked, and consumed as lessons. Even death carried symbolic weight. A woman who perished in the collar symbolized the ultimate price of disobedience. One who drowned on the stool symbolized the silencing of unruly voices. One beaten to death in the pillory symbolized the power of communal justice. These deaths were not considered tragedies, but validations, proof that order had triumphed, that shame had done its work. The legacy of this symbolism endures. We no longer see iron collars in marketplaces, but we still see women reduced to symbols. Labels like nag, slut, or witch operate like shame cloaks, turning individuals into caricatures. Online shaming creates digital pillories, where women's mistakes are immortalized as public warnings. Symbolism still disciplines, reminding women that stepping out of line risks transformation into object, into lesson, into warning. The devices of old remind us that punishment is never only about pain, it is about meaning. The collar, the stool, the pillory, the cloak, each was a symbol, and each turned women into warnings. Their suffering taught obedience not just to them, but to everyone who watched. And though the iron has rusted, the symbols remain, reshaped into new forms, still whispering the same message. Obedience is safety, defiance is death. The iron collars are rusted, the pillories are broken wood in forgotten cellars, the ducking stools sit as museum curiosities, their beams silent. Yet their legacy lingers not in iron or water, but in the persistence of humiliation as a weapon. Societies may have abandoned devices of shame, but the logic behind them, the belief that women can be controlled through disgrace, remains disturbingly alive. Today, the devices are invisible, but their effects are just as real. Consider the fate of women in the digital age, where once they were strapped into pillories, now they are locked into viral posts. Online shaming functions as a modern marketplace, where reputations are paraded and mocked before global crowds. A single mistake, a rumor, or a photograph can unleash ridicule that spreads faster than any medieval town crier's voice. Instead of rotten vegetables, the weapons are comments, memes, and hashtags. Instead of a marketplace audience of hundreds, the crowd is millions, watching humiliation unfold in real time. Death does not always come physically, but dignity is often destroyed, and in tragic cases, lives are lost to despair. The obsession with controlling women's voices is equally familiar. Medieval bridals silenced tongues with iron spikes. Today, ridicule, harassment, and dismissal accomplish the same. Women who speak out in politics, business, or activism are branded shrill, hysterical, or too emotional. Their words are not pierced by iron, but by labels designed to delegitimize. Silence is still enforced not with chains, but with ridicule, trolling, and systemic dismissal. The weapon has changed, but the logic is identical. Body control endures as well. The iron corsets that once crushed ribs have been replaced by impossible beauty standards. Diet culture, cosmetic industries, and digital filters create prisons of appearance. Women are not strapped into cages of metal, but they are trapped in cycles of shame for failing to match manufactured ideals. The corset spikes have been replaced by advertisements and algorithms, reminding women daily that their worth is tied to conformity. Humiliation still reshapes bodies, only now it hides behind glamour. The persistence of double standards is another echo. Men still escape ridicule for behaviors that condemn women. An outspoken man is assertive, an outspoken woman is obnoxious. A promiscuous man is admired, a promiscuous woman is shamed. The ducking stool may be gone, but reputational drowning continues in every whispered judgment and every viral scandal. The message is unchanged. Women's independence remains suspicious, their sexuality dangerous, their voices disruptive. Even rituals of entertainment reflect the old logic. Just as medieval crowds gathered to laugh at chained women, modern audiences consume humiliation as spectacle. Reality television thrives on public breakdowns. Social media delights in scandals. The public appetite for disgrace ensures that humiliation remains profitable. The cruelty of the past has been repackaged as content, streamed into homes instead of staged in marketplaces. The theatre has shifted, but the performance endures. The most haunting continuity is the normalization of humiliation. Medieval towns considered duckings and pillories ordinary. Today, online shaming, sexist jokes, and impossible expectations are brushed off as just culture. This normalization is what makes humiliation so powerful. It hides in plain sight, disguised as tradition, entertainment, or humor. Just as communities once convinced themselves that collars and cloaks were moral, we now convince ourselves that ridicule and harassment are harmless. Yet resistance also endures. Women who once mocked their punishers, whispered behind bridles, or survived duckings have modern counterparts. Campaigns like Me Too challenge silence. Movements for body positivity dismantle beauty prisons. Activists expose double standards, demanding accountability. Each act of defiance chips away at invisible iron, proving that the logic of shame can be confronted. Where humiliation thrives on silence, resistance thrives on solidarity. The lesson of history is clear. The death of dignity is as devastating as the death of the body. To be stripped of voice, mocked in public, or reduced to caricature is to be erased. The medieval devices killed slowly, but humiliation today can still destroy lives. The rusted iron reminds us not only of what was done, but of what can still be done if humiliation is tolerated. To dismantle these invisible devices requires recognition. We must see that public shaming, online mobs, and sexist double standards are not harmless. They are modern collars, cloaks, and pillories. We must recognize that ridicule, when weaponized, becomes violence, and we must refuse to participate in humiliation as entertainment. Justice cannot be built on mockery, and equality cannot exist where shame remains a tool of control. History whispers its warning. Societies that normalize humiliation will always find new ways to enforce it. The devices may change, but the logic will persist until confronted. If we want to end the cycle, we must not only break the iron of the past, but unmask the invisible iron of today. Only then can dignity survive unchained.